But that time, I saw a picture of his wife and one of his kids. And I remember thinking to myself, like, wow, she's so beautiful. And I, like, took a step back, and I was just like, this man has a gorgeous house. He has beautiful babies. He has a beautiful wife. He has an awesome job. Like, why would he want to leave this? And I remember talking to him about it, and that was the first time that I tried to actually say, what do you think about not separating from your wife? Like, what if you really try to work on this? And he had expressed to me that we've tried to work on this, and it's not working, so that is why we're separating.
As we move into 2026, something uneasy is stirring inside the walls of Dodge Correctional Institution. For years, Chris Watts stayed quiet, almost protective of his former mistress, Nichol Kessinger. But the silence just broke. Newly leaked letters from 2024 and 2025 reveal a man who is no longer playing the part of the lone monster. In these pages, Chris uses one word over and over again: manipulated. He is now pointing directly at a moment we all remember, but through a much darker lens. The morning of the murders, before the bodies were even cold, Kessinger urged him to delete his entire Facebook history. At the time, we called it a cooperating witness being cautious. But with Chris now claiming she was the one guiding his hand, that digital cleanup looks less like caution and more like an urgent script being followed. It makes you wonder, is it possible that the cooperating witness was actually the one holding the script all along? What you are about to hear is the result of me digging through thousands of pages of official records and FBI reports. So, why am I back here? Why am I digging through the ruins of a case that most people think was buried long ago? The thing is, the more I looked at the official closing of the Watts case, the more it felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. Back in 2018, we were all so blinded by the sheer horror of what Chris Watts did. We were fixated on the porch interview, the oil tanks, and the senseless loss of 3 innocent lives. But while we were looking at him, the legal machinery was moving at a lightning pace behind the scenes. What struck me here was how quickly the investigation pivoted away from Nichol Kessinger the moment Chris confessed. It was almost too clean. 1 minute, she is being questioned about her whereabouts and her strange Google searches, and the next she is essentially wiped from the narrative. But, as I started rereading the thousands of pages in the Discovery files recently, something did not sit right with me. I found myself staring at the timestamps and the interview transcripts, realizing that there are massive gaps that were simply glossed over because the district attorney had a confession in hand. At this point, I started questioning the true nature of the deal made with Kessinger. The problem is, the district attorney's office seemed to grant her a get-out-of-jail-free card before the ink on Chris's confession was even dry. Why the rush? Why was there no further push to explain why her phone pinged in Frederick at 6:16 in the morning on the day of the murders? And this is important. When a case is closed this fast, the truth often gets traded for efficiency. It feels like the system just wanted to put a lid on the box and move on. Meanwhile, if you look at the forensic digital reports, you see a woman who was not just a passive bystander. You see someone who was deleting call logs and messages while the police were still searching for a missing pregnant mother. From there, I realized that if we want to find out what really happened in that house, we have to look past the handcuffs and start looking at the gaps. We have to ask why her father was so involved in her police interviews and why her story changed every time a new piece of evidence was presented. Which means, we are not just looking for a killer anymore, we are looking for the architect of the fallout. That is when it clicked for me. The deal was not just about getting information, it was about ending the media circus as quickly as possible. But in doing so, they left a door wide open for doubt. In other words, they settled for a partial truth because the full truth was too complicated to prosecute. At this point, I am not just looking at a closed case file. I am looking at a series of unanswered questions that have been haunting the public for nearly 8 years. The reason this matters is that justice should not have an expiration date, and it certainly should not be based on an incomplete investigation. What I found was that every time the detectives got close to a contradiction in Kessinger's story, the conversation was redirected, which tells us that there was a conscious effort to keep her as a witness rather than a suspect. The thing is, the public's obsession with this case isn't just about the crime itself anymore. It is about the feeling that something was hidden in plain sight. And then, you have the brand new letters from Chris, where he is finally calling out the manipulation. It makes you realize that the version of the story we were told in 2018 was just the version that was easiest to sell. So, let us go back. Let us look at what was actually said in those rooms before the deal was finalized. Because the silence of the last few years is finally starting to crack, and what is leaking out is a lot more complicated than a lone monster in a truck, which means we are going to look at the players, the lies, and the deal that changed everything. So, let us talk about the players. When we look back at 2018, the media gave us a very specific image of Nichol Kessinger. She was portrayed as the other woman who was tragically lied to, a victim of Chris Watts's deception who just wanted to help the police once she realized the truth. But when you actually sit down and read her interview transcript side by side with the digital forensic evidence, that image starts to crumble. The thing is, Nichol Kessinger was not just some casual acquaintance who got swept up in a whirlwind romance. She was someone who, according to the FBI's own reports, was digging into the Watts family long before Chris ever claimed his marriage was over. What I found was that, as early as 2017, nearly a full year before the murders, Kessinger was already searching for Shannon Watts online. At this point, I started questioning the innocent victim narrative. If she was as clueless as she claimed to be, why was she tracking the wife of her future lover so far in advance? It suggests a level of premeditation, or at least an obsession, that the prosecution chose to ignore. And this is important. She did not just search for Shannon, she searched for man having an affair and how to prepare for a new life, while Chris was still very much living with his pregnant wife. Meanwhile, let us look at her behavior during the initial investigation. The problem is, Kessinger did not just hand over her phone to the police. Before she even met with detectives, she had already deleted her entire call history and all of her text messages with Chris Watts. From there, you have to ask yourself, if you have nothing to hide, why are you spending hours scrubbing your digital footprint? Which means, she knew exactly what was on that phone, and she knew it would look bad, perhaps even criminal. At this point, I want to focus on a detail that always felt like a gut punch to me. During her interviews, NK told detectives that she did not even know Shannon was pregnant until the news broke. But the digital forensic team found that she had spent over an hour looking at Shannon's Facebook and Instagram pages, which were filled with pregnancy announcements and ultrasound photos. Because of that, her claim of not knowing feels like a blatant lie designed to make her look more sympathetic. What do you think? Is it possible to spend an hour on a pregnant woman's social media and not notice she is expecting? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is where the victim story truly falls apart for me. That is when the father, Dwayne Kessinger, enters the picture. In other words, Nichol did not go into this alone. Her father was present for her interviews, often steering the conversation or answering for her when the questions got too pointed. What struck me here was how much influence he seemed to have over the investigators. It felt like they were interviewing a corporate executive rather than a potential accomplice in a triple homicide, which tells us that there was a protective layer around her from the very beginning. And then, there is the matter of her employment. Kessinger worked for a contractor at Anadarko Petroleum, the very same company Chris worked for, and the same company that owned the oil site where the bodies were hidden. The reason this matters is that she had intimate knowledge of the company's logistics and site locations, which means she knew exactly how remote and inaccessible those oil tanks were. So, when Chris claims in his new letters that she manipulated the plan, her professional background makes that claim a lot more terrifying. At this point, I cannot help but feel that the investigators were so eager to secure a win against Chris that they let a major player walk right out the back door. They treated her like a star witness, even when her story changed every time they confronted her with a new fact. Because of that, the public is left with this nagging feeling that the person who truly pulled the strings never spent a single night in a jail cell. So, as we move forward, we have to look at her as more than just a mistress. We have to look at her as a strategist, someone who knew how to erase herself from the crime scene before the crime even happened, which tells us that if Chris was the hand that committed the act, NK might have been the mind that cleared the path. And this is important. If the digital evidence shows she was lying about the small things, what else was she lying about? So, we have talked about the players and the motives. Now, I want to take you into the wires, the signals, and the data points that the investigation seemed to treat as mere background noise. The thing is, in 2018, digital forensics were advanced, but the way they were applied in this case felt remarkably selective. When I was digging through the thousands of pages of the FBI's technical reports, I found things that simply do not line up with the official story. What I found was that while Chris Watts was clumsy with his digital trail, Nichol Kessinger was surgical. But there is one ghost in the machine that she could not erase. And this is important. It is the cell tower ping at 6:16 in the morning on the day of the murders. At this point, I started questioning the physics of her alibi. Kessinger lived in North Glen, which is about a 25-minute drive from the Watts home in Frederick. She told investigators she was at home, waking up for work. The problem is, her phone did not ping a tower near her house. It pinged a tower in Frederick, just minutes away from where Shannon and the girls were being taken. Which means, if her phone was there, she was there. From there, you have to ask, what was she doing in Frederick at that exact hour? Was she watching the house? Was she waiting for a signal? What do you think? Is it just a glitch in the system, or is a cell tower ping the most honest witness we have in this case? Let me know in the comments, because to me, a phone does not lie about its location at 6:16 a.m. Meanwhile, the digital scrubbing started almost immediately. What struck me here was the sheer urgency of it. According to the discovery files, before the police even officially declared Shannon missing, Kessinger was already instructing Chris to delete his Facebook. In other words, she was managing the digital evidence before there was even a public crime. Because of that, it feels less like a mistress worried about her reputation and more like someone clearing the brush before the fire department arrives. The reason this matters is that she did not just tell him to delete things, she deleted things herself. She wiped her entire call log. She deleted every single text message from Chris. At this point, I have to wonder why the detectives did not push harder. If you are a cooperating witness, you do not destroy the very evidence the police need to build a timeline. Which tells us that she was either incredibly lucky or she knew exactly how much she could get away with. And then, we have the Google searches. We already know she was looking up Shannon long before they met. But there is a search on her phone from 2018 that still sends chills down my spine. She was searching for, can police see deleted text messages, and how long do phone companies keep records? That is when it clicked for me. These are not the searches of a woman in love. These are the searches of a person concerned with forensic recovery. So, Let us look at the timeline of those searches. They happened right around the time she was supposedly realizing Chris was a liar. The problem is, the timeline shows she was worried about her data before she went to the police. Which means, her cooperation might have been a strategic move to get ahead of the evidence she knew was still sitting on the servers. At this point, I started questioning whether her confession to the police was actually a curated version of the truth designed to fit what she could not delete. From there, we look at the coordinates. Kessinger was an environmental safety officer. She knew the GPS coordinates of the oil sites. She knew the layouts. And this is important. The FBI found that she had accessed maps related to Anadarko's remote sites, specifically the ones where the bodies were eventually found, which tells us that she had the technical knowledge to navigate those fields in the dark. Because of that, when Chris claims in his new letters that everything was manipulated, we have to look at the one person who actually understood the terrain. In other words, the digital trail is not just about what is there, it is about what is missing. The sacred deal essentially allowed these digital gaps to remain unfilled. Which means, as we move toward 2026, the only way to find the truth is to go back to those servers and find what was buried in the cloud. The thing is, technology has caught up. What was deleted in 2018 might not be so hidden anymore. So, we have to ask ourselves, if that data comes back, whose story is it going to destroy? So, let us talk about the most critical window of this entire tragedy, the first 48 hours, while the rest of the world was looking at a panicked father on a front porch. A much more calculated operation was happening in the shadows. The thing is, we were told that Nichol Kessinger was a victim of deception, a woman who came forward out of the goodness of her heart. But, when you look at her actions during those first 2 days, a very different pattern emerges. At this point, I started questioning whether we were watching a witness or a masterclass in forensic evasion. What I found was that, before she ever stepped foot into a police station, Nichol Kessinger was busy. She wasn't just scared. She was surgical. And this is important, she spent hours deleting every single trace of her communication with Chris Watts. She wiped call logs, she scrubbed text messages, and she even deleted her entire search history. The problem is, if you are truly an innocent victim who has just realized your boyfriend's family is missing, your first instinct should be to preserve evidence, not destroy it. What struck me here was how she managed to navigate the investigation to ensure the police only saw what she wanted them to see. Meanwhile, the letters from Chris Watts in 2024 and 2025 provide a chilling new context to these actions. That is when the story takes a dark turn. Chris reveals that the digital cleanup wasn't just his idea. In these new communications, he claims that Kessinger actually instructed him on how to clean his digital trail. He describes her as being the one who told him to delete his Facebook and to get rid of certain apps before the authorities could seize his devices. Because of that, the image of the clueless mistress is replaced by someone who understood the weight of a digital footprint. From there, we have to look at how she handled the investigators. The thing is, she successfully pivoted the entire narrative to be about her own heartbreak. She painted herself as the woman who was lied to about the divorce, even though her own phone records showed she had been searching for Shanann for over a year. In other words, she used her cooperation as a weapon to gain immunity. She gave the police just enough information to make them look elsewhere, which tells us that she wasn't just helping the law, she was leading it away from herself. At this point, I want to ask you a serious question. If you were the investigator in that room, would you believe this was the behavior of a panicked person, or is this someone cleaning up a digital crime scene? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because the difference between a victim and an accomplice often lies in the data they choose to destroy. The reason this matters is that the police allowed her to dictate the terms of her cooperation. What struck me here was that they never questioned why she was so quick to delete her SIM card or why she was Googling. Can police see deleted texts before she ever called them? Which means she was checking the perimeter of the law before she decided to step inside it. So, while Chris was failing a polygraph and falling apart, Nichol was calmly managing the fallout. Which tells us that the power dynamic in this relationship was never what we thought it was. And this is important. If Chris is telling the truth in his latest letters, then she wasn't just a bystander. She was the one holding the manual. She was the one who knew that in 2018, if you delete it fast enough, it might just stay gone forever. The problem is, she didn't count on the FBI being able to recover the ghost of those deleted files. At this point, it feels like we are looking at a master manipulator who understood exactly how to play the victim card to perfection. In other words, she gave the detectives a villain in Chris Watts, and in exchange, they gave her a fresh start. Because of that, the first 48 hours were not a search for the truth, they were a race to bury it. And then, you realize that the most successful manipulation didn't happen in the bedroom, it happened in the interrogation room. So, as we move forward, keep that image in your mind. A woman deleting her history while a search party is looking for two little girls. Which means, as we look at the next part of this investigation, we have to ask, who was really in charge of the script? The thing is, the hand that deletes the evidence is often just as guilty as the hand that commits the act. So, we have to look at the parts of this case that simply do not sit right with any logical person. The thing is, when we talk about a tragedy of this magnitude, we expect the people involved to be consumed by grief, or at least a paralyzing sense of shock. But when you look at the digital behavior of Nichol Kessinger in the days following the murders, you do not see shock, you see a business strategy. At this point, I started questioning the very soul of the investigation. Why did the district attorney grant her immunity so quickly when her digital trail was screaming for further scrutiny? This is the part I couldn't get past. The cold, calculated nature of those searches. While the world was mourning the horrific discovery of Shannon, Bella, and Celeste, Nichol Kessinger was not searching for how to process trauma or justice for the victims. What I found was that on August 19, 2018, she was searching for her own future fame. According to the discovery files, while the investigators were still at the crime scene, Kessinger was Googling things like, how much money did Amber Frey make? And, Amber Frey book deal. The problem is, how does a person who just found out her boyfriend is a family annihilator immediately pivot to calculating the net worth of a famous mistress? And this is important, she was also searching for, did people like Amber Frey, and looking for lucrative brand ambassador contracts. At this point, it becomes clear that she was more concerned with her public image and her potential profit than she was with the lives that had just been extinguished. What struck me here was the sheer lack of empathy required to analyze the Amber Frey playbook, while the bodies of those children were barely out of the oil tanks. Meanwhile, we have to address the actions of the district attorney. The reason this matters is that the DA had access to these exact same search records before they finalized the agreement to protect her. From there, you have to ask, why was she given a get-out-of-jail-free card? Which tells us that the system was more interested in having a star witness to secure a quick plea deal than they were in holding every participant accountable for their behavior. Because of that, the secret deal feels like a betrayal of the victims. What do you think? Does someone who is searching for brand deals and book contracts in the wake of a massacre deserve the full protection of the state? Let me know in the comments, because this is the detail that proves she wasn't just a victim, she was a visionary of her own notoriety. In other words, She was preparing for a media career while the police were still identifying the bodies. Which means she knew the story was going to be massive, and she wanted to see if she could monetize it. At this point, I started questioning if the DA's office even considered her a suspect for a single second. The problem is, the moment she handed over a few selected pieces of evidence, they treated her like a hero, which tells us that they fell for the same innocent mistress act that she had been perfecting since she first began stalking the Watts family on social media in 2017. And then, you realize that the immunity deal did not just protect her from jail, it protected her from having to explain those cold-blooded searches to a jury. If this had gone to trial, those searches about Amber Frey's net worth would have been the centerpiece of the prosecution's character analysis. Because of that, the DA's rush to close the case actually served as a shield for Kessinger, which means the efficiency of the legal system became the enemy of the full truth. So, as we look at these holes in the gospel, we realize that the biggest hole of all is the lack of a moral compass in the investigation's final days. The thing is, the authorities were so focused on Chris Watts that they allowed a person who was calculating her payday to slip through the cracks, which tells us that they settled for a fast conviction instead of a complete one. Because of that, Nichol Kessinger was allowed to transition from a mistress to a ghost, protected by a new identity and a secret deal, without ever having to justify her actions. That is when the true weight of the secret deal hits you. It was not just about justice for Shannon. It was about how much the state was willing to overlook to get a signature on a confession. And this is important. If we accept this version of events, we are accepting that a person can destroy evidence and calculate a book deal as long as they provide the winning testimony. So, we are left with a case that is closed on paper, but wide open in the hearts of anyone who values actual justice. Which means, as we move into the final chapters of this story, we have to decide for ourselves who the real architect was. So, we have seen the holes in the digital evidence and the suspicious silence of the legal system. Now, we must enter the most chilling part of this journey, the mind of Chris Watts in 2026. The thing is, time changes a man, especially when that man is sitting in a maximum security cell in Wisconsin with nothing but the four walls and his memories. In the early years, Chris was quiet, almost protective of Nichol Kessinger. But something has shifted. As we move further away from 2018, the man who once took the full blame has started to talk, and what he is saying is turning the original narrative upside down. What I found was that Chris Watts in 2026 feels like a man who has nothing left to lose. He has no family, no freedom, and most importantly, he no longer has the protection of the woman he once thought was his savior. At this point, I started questioning the authenticity of his newest revelations. Chris is now revealing a darker side of their relationship, claiming that Kessinger didn't just love him, she programmed him. He describes a dynamic where she exploited his psychological weaknesses, constantly whispering about a life where his baggage no longer existed. The problem is, how much of this can we actually believe? Chris claims that Kessinger made specific promises about their future, promises that were contingent on him fixing the situation with Shannon. And this is important, he describes her manipulation as a slow drip of poison, isolating him from his parents and making him feel like his daughters were an anchor dragging him down. What struck me here was how he describes her leash. He claims she told him exactly how to behave during the investigation, promising that if they both stayed quiet and played their parts, they would eventually find each other again. Meanwhile, we have to analyze the motive behind these claims. From there, we must ask, is this the honest confession of a man seeking true repentance? Or is it the cold-blooded revenge of a man who realized he was abandoned? Which tells us that the psychology here is incredibly messy. In 2018, Chris thought he was a hero in a dark romance. By 2026, he has realized he was just a disposable tool in someone else's plan. Because of that, his words carry a different kind of weight, the weight of a man who has seen the sacred Dale benefit everyone except him. At this point, let's look at the specific allegations. Chris claims that on the night of the murders, he was in a state of heightened suggestion, almost as if he were following a script that had been rehearsed in their long, late-night phone calls. Which means, he is now accusing her of being the architect of the intent, even if his were the hands that committed the act. In other words, he is no longer willing to be the lone monster. He wants the world to see the person who, in his mind, handed him the weapon. What do you think? Does a murderer's accusation hold any value when it fits into gaps in the investigation file? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is the crossroads where the official truth meets the prison truth. The reason this matters is that when a killer's accusations align perfectly with the missing text messages and the unexplained cell tower pings, it becomes very hard to look the other way. So, we are forced to wonder if Chris is finally telling the truth because the lie no longer serves him, which tells us that the bond they shared was built on a foundation of mutual destruction. That is when it becomes clear that Chris is haunted by the fact that he is rotting in a cell while Kessinger is living under a new name, perhaps watching the same news reports he is. And then, you realize the true nature of his revelations. They are an attempt to drag her back into the light. He is using his voice to ensure that even if she is legally free, she will never be free from the suspicion of the public. Because of that, the Chris Watts of 2026 is more dangerous to Nichol Kessinger than he ever was to the police. He knows the secrets that weren't in the deleted messages. He knows the metaphors they used. The thing is, even if the DA won't reopen the case, the court of public opinion is listening. So, as we wrap up this analysis, we have to decide if we are listening to a liar trying to share the blame, or a man who is finally tired of carrying the cross for a crime that had two authors. Which means, the final verdict might not come from a judge, but from the evidence that refused to stay buried. So, we have reached the end of this deep dive, but does it feel like a conclusion? The thing is, the more we peel back the layers of the Watts case, the less closed it actually feels. We were promised a story of a lone monster, a quick confession, and a justice system that worked with clinical efficiency. But, as we have seen through the forensic gaps and the prison revelations of 2026, that efficiency came at a staggering cost. It cost us the full truth. At this point, I started questioning what we truly value more, the speed of a conviction or the integrity of the facts. The reason this matters is because the Watts case serves as a haunting lesson about the surface of truth. What I found was that when a system is overwhelmed by a crime so horrific, it often chooses the path of least resistance. The district attorney's deal with Nichol Kessinger was the fastest way to put Chris Watts behind bars for life without the chaos of a televised trial. The problem is, by choosing the fastest route, they left wounds in the public consciousness that may never heal. They left us with thousands of pages of discovery files that point toward an accomplice who was never truly pursued. In other words, we are living in the fallout of a compromise. From there, we have to look at the precedent this sets. If the digital evidence of a mistress searching for profit and deleting her history is not enough to warrant a full trial, then what is? What struck me here was the silence that has followed for nearly 8 years. Which tells us that while the legal file is locked, the moral file remains wide open. I don't have all the answers, but I do know that justice shouldn't have gaps this wide. A gap where a phone pings at 6:16 a.m. and no one asks why. A gap where a SIM card is destroyed and it is called cooperation. Meanwhile, we have to consider the role of the public in all of this. Because of that, I have laid out everything I found. from the brand new letters in 2026 to the cold, calculated searches in the old files. Now it is your turn. I want you to take these pieces and put them together. What is your theory? Who do you believe was the true architect of the fallout? Please, share your perspective in the comments. Your voice is the only thing that keeps these questions alive in a system that would rather forget them. At this point, we are standing at a crossroads. 2026 might be the year that the old deals expire, but are we ready to face a truth that is even darker than what we already know? Which means, we have to be prepared for the possibility that Chris Watts was not the only one who knew what was going to happen in that house. The thing is, we often want our villains to be simple, but reality is usually far more complicated and far more sinister. What struck me here was how easy it was for one person to disappear into a new identity while the other became the face of evil. Which tells us that as long as those deleted messages remain a mystery, the case can never truly be over. What do you think is hiding in those deleted messages? Is it just the flirtation of a mistress, or is it the blueprint for a crime? So, as the screen goes dark on this investigation, remember that history is not just what is written in the court transcripts. It is what we refuse to stop looking for. That is when the real work begins, when we stop accepting the easy answers and start demanding the ones that were deleted. Which means, as we move forward, we must keep asking the questions that no one wanted to answer in 2018. And this is important. Justice is not just a verdict. It is the courage to look at the whole picture, no matter how much it hurts. The thing is, the truth is still out there, buried in the digital ghosts of a relationship that was never supposed to be found. Thanks for watching. Your support keeps this investigation alive. Like, subscribe, and share your theories below. See you next time.